Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of Floss Weekly. This week, Aaron Newcomb joins me. We're going to talk about Gentoo, a really configurable Linux distribution. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Aaron Newcomb, episode 212, recorded May 23rd, 2012, Gentoo. It's time for Floss Weekly, the show about free, libre, open-source software. I'm your host, Randal Schwartz, merlin@stonehenge.com, bringing you each week, or as often as I can get to it anyway, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects you may have never heard of, projects you are probably really familiar with, but just wondered how it all works behind the scenes. I try to get a good variety of all that sort of stuff on the show, and this week is no exception to that. But before we talk about what this show is going to be, let's bring on my co-host for this week, Aaron Newcomb. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me back.
And I see you're in the TWiT brick TWiT house, right?
Right. In fact, I was just talking to someone this weekend at Maker Faire about that, and I said, "Oh yeah, I go to the cottage all the time." They're like, "Cottage?" I didn't think they were in the cottage. I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm so used to saying it." Yeah, back in the brick house. We've got some donuts here, some yummy donuts that I'm munching on. So,
no donuts here, darn it.
Yeah,
okay.
That's one of the advantages of being here live is I occasionally bring in breakfast.
I know. And for those of you that are watching the video, you recognize that this is an entirely new place that I'm broadcasting from. In fact, some of you who have been longtime watchers of the show notice the Blue Yeti sitting next to me. This is, in fact, my personal Blue Yeti that I've been using when I was in my house in Beaverton. Of course, for these also following my other stuff, you know I'm homeless now, so I'm actually in this just sort of back bedroom of my friend Bill's place. And the Yeti has been sitting over here in one of the boxes over there. So it's really kind of nice here. I'm next to my familiar stuff, and I'm actually doing a show, which is pretty rare. Mostly I'm doing stuff from other places. I'm also wearing, if you can see, just get up for a second, I'm wearing the Do You Floss Weekly t-shirt, which is some of the stuff that is part of the chain of t-shirts and stuff that you can buy from Becky Lobo Welsh's website, which I forget the name of, but that's okay. That's the plug she gets for it today. So that's enough of that. So our project today is Gentoo. Now, Gentoo, and representing Gentoo will be Jeff Horelick, who's one of the key developers for that. From what I understand, first off, well, Gentoo is Linux, so I'm going to admit up front, I don't know a lot about this stuff. I'm a FreeBSD guy, OpenBSD guy, that sort of thing, and so I'm just not much on Linux. But Gentoo is well known as the Linux in which everything gets compiled from sources. There aren't like binary distributions of things. And then from what I could read, though, it's not actually totally true. You have to bootstrap somehow. But it's sort of the most flexible Linux distro out there. So we want to talk with Jeff about that. Aaron, what do you know about Gentoo?
Well, of course, I've heard about it. It's been around for quite a while now, but it's always kind of scared me a little bit. You know, I don't necessarily want to compile everything from source these days. There are things that I like about Linux. Compiling from source is not one of them. So, yeah, I'm kind of curious to see what what the arguments are. You know, why would somebody want to do? What are people doing with Gentoo? Why do they run Gentoo? People that do run Gentoo seem to be very dedicated. They seem to really be enthusiastic about this process of compiling and having everything just the way you want it. So I'm really curious to see what he has to say about that and kind of give me some reasons to go try it out. And maybe I'll try to download, get started with it here on my laptop while we're talking. Before you get into the ad, too, I do want to say, I don't even know if we have an ad today, but no. I do want to say that for all of those that I met and talked to at Maker Faire, Bay Area, last weekend, I just want to say thanks. It was nice to meet y'all. Ran into a few people at the Bay Area Maker Faire. It was only 100,000 people there, so it's not like just me and a few friends, but there was a few people there. Some of the project people that were displaying projects were open source related. They were running open source software or open hardware, a lot of open hardware projects this year. In fact, I ran a couple that you're going to get some emails from, Randal, just to let you know. Cool. So yeah. We're going to get some of them are local and can actually be in the studio. So I thought it would be good to get some of those on the show. But just wanted to give a big thanks to Maker Faire for having me there, and also just to say thanks. And it was nice to meet all the people that stopped by. Very
good, very good. Well, I have a big Blue Yeti all warmed up here, and Sitting here drinking my comfortable Coke Zero over here. Not to plug that either, but that is what the drink of the day is. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our guest. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And where are you speaking to us from?
Maryland on the East Coast.
On the East Coast. Wonderful. In fact, I'm going to actually be out on the East Coast tomorrow, just north of you. So up there in New York City visiting some friends and stuff. So, of course, that's always the travelogue part of the show. I always have to get that out of the way. Where are we talking to you from? And where am I going to be relative to that? So now that we got that out of the way, let's get back to the main topic of the show, which is Gentoo. Now, I made sort of a half-prepared statement about Gentoo at the beginning of the show, whatever I could research this morning and last night. But why don't you start and give us sort of the overview. What is the Gentoo project about, and why does it exist?
Well, Gentoo was created as what's called a meta-distribution, which means it kind of tries to be all things to all people, and it can be modified to literally do pretty much whatever you want.
Okay, go ahead.
It's also source-based, which is what gives it all that power.
Okay, so let's back up just a step because I don't have a lot of experience in Linux world. I'm more of a FreeBSD guy and OpenBSD before that, and OpenSolaris before that, and Linux way back in the day. But so there are many distributions of Linux. I mean, these are things we would call like Red Hat or Fedora or I don't know, Debian. These are all different distributions, right? How do they differ, and why would you want to have different distributions?
Well, generally they differ between, either package management or kind of set of packages or what have you. And, for example, Red Hat uses the Yum package manager, Debian uses apt-get, and so on. And, sort of in the same way, Gentoo uses a package manager called Portage, but the difference is that Debian and Fedora and so on use binary packages. They're pre-compiled with, a default set of settings, and you can just install them and you're done. With Gentoo, it's source-based, so you set what versions you want and what settings right when you're installing the package, and then you compile it.
Oh, why would that make any difference? I mean, if I run the compiler on, say, Emacs, and you run the compiler on Emacs, aren't we going to end up with the same thing?
Well, let's say you didn't want Emacs with a GUI, with a GTK GUI. You could compile that out. Or let's say you didn't, you wanted LDAP supporting your Emacs. You could compile that in, and, mine might not have that, or the default Emacs in, for example, Debian might not have it because the maintainer decided not many people use LDAP support in Emacs, so I'm going to, not enable that by default.
But would this all apply all the way down to the level of the kernel? I mean, would I need to have options on the kernel, like what kind of support it has in it?
Well, by defaulting Gentoo, you do compile your own kernel, and that can be a bit difficult for some people, but there are ways in Gentoo to just say, give me a relatively default kernel compile, and I'm happy with that, and you can do that. But it does go all the way up the stack.
When you get something loaded onto your machine, there has to be some kernel running. So obviously, so let's back up and talk about the bootstrapping process, because at some point I've got to download at least enough of a system to run the kernel and have my basic commands and be able to compile more things, right?
Right. What you do, the Gentoo install process isn't just an installer that you basically click, next, finish. It's a set of steps that you run in the shell from either an existing distro on your system or a live environment, and that installs the base system without a kernel, like GCC, Perl, Python, and so on. And then once you, chroot into that, you can then install the kernel and install other stuff and then, reboot and have it on your system.
I missed the little part in the middle. You said chroot into it. How does that work, and why do I need to do that?
like I said, you're in the live environment. CH rooting puts you into the Gentoo environment that you just effectively extracted from the tarball. And, from there you can run commands like you were in the native Gentoo install when you're not.
Okay, I want to come back to that a little bit later. I want to talk more about the details of the technology here. But what I want to do now is sort of find out, how did you get involved with Gentoo, and what's your relationship with the project now?
Well, I got started in Gentoo. I originally got started playing with it years ago, probably about 6-7 years ago. But I started actively using it again about a year ago, and I'm currently a Gentoo developer, and I maintain several packages in the tree.
Okay, and what brought you to Gentoo in the first place, then?
Well, what brought me to Gentoo is the fact that it's very different from most other distros, and it gives a level of power and flexibility that really no other distro has. I love that let's say I have MySQL installed. If an update for some reason breaks my MySQL databases, I can always, go forward a version, go back a version, and all that is completely supported in the package manager.
Cool. And how do I we talk about like setting the optimizations and things like that. How do I know what to set? Is there some sort of community around this, or maybe like books or something on this that tells me like, okay, you want to install it this way and you want to turn on these options because it's really good for this kind of a computer or something?
Well, there is a big community around Gentoo, but the default way is to set up what's called a Gentoo profile, which you change with the tool called eSelect, and you say, I'm running a GNOME desktop, and it'll set default optimizations and settings for GNOME desktop, and then you can customize that and see what's available via running various commands like one called eQuery, or even Emerge, Gentoo's package manager, will say what use flags and settings a package has when you were about to install it.
So let's talk about that for a little bit, especially with Emerge, because that's the one I'm familiar with. Now, I haven't run Gentoo before, although I am probably a little bit more familiar with Linux systems than Randal is.
Yeah.
I'm running the setup now actually in VirtualBox on top of Ubuntu. So, just to describe this for people that may be familiar with a typical GUI Linux distribution setup program. This is actually, command line. When you get in, it says, you need to select a kernel to boot. You select the kernel, it loads up, does some, detection of devices and so forth. And now I'm actually down to the point where I can actually select it actually gets me to a command line prompt, basically running the live CD, but no GUI at all. So just to level set, this is going to be a little bit more advanced probably than, I'm probably not going to be able to get my mom to run this out of the bat, right? Yeah,
it's definitely not a distro for your mom or your grandpa or something like that. But it's very good if you're kind of a hardcore geek, or there are distributions like Sabayon and Calculate Linux that actually build on Gentoo and add a nice GUI installer and, a default set of packages, be it GNOME or XFCE or what have you.
Right, because I know that I can tell you right now, if I was to give this to my mom or somebody less technically astute than I am, they're going to have some trouble navigating this. But like you say, there is an advantage. So let's get back to Emerge now and talk about the fact that we're going to be compiling a lot of packages. So one of the disadvantages that people usually talk about is the time that it takes to actually install things in Gentoo. Is that correct?
It is correct. It does take, for example, installing Firefox, even if you have a pretty hefty system, doesn't take 2 seconds like it takes on, let's say, Ubuntu or Debian or Fedora. It does take, 5-10 minutes on a nice system, or it could take up to like 2 hours on a rather old like Pentium 4. But for huge packages like Firefox, we do offer binary packages. And for other stuff, really, Firefox is, one of the longest compile times, and the other stuff is a lot shorter.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know that there was the option, actually, to take a binary package as opposed to the source package. So you can do that. Now, how big is that list? What other applications are in there besides Firefox?
Well, for binary packages that we offer in the repositories, it's pretty much Firefox, CMonkey, which is the recontinuation of the original Mozilla browser, LibreOffice, and Google Chrome.
Mm-hmm. And those all make a lot of sense, actually, because I bet all of those are going to take forever to compile and probably have like hundreds, if not thousands, of options when you go to compile those from source.
Actually, they don't have that many options. The biggest thing is it takes a lot of time and a lot of disk space. But the other thing that Gentoo has is it actually has full support for binary packages. So someone on the internet, and there are several, can set up what's called a bin host, and they can put up, every package in the repositories repackaged as a binary.
Right. Now, I want to up-level just a little bit because we're talking about binaries and source and everything. I want to make sure that people who aren't as familiar with these types of systems know what we're talking about. And so I'll try to describe this, and you can correct me if I get it wrong or add to what I'm saying. So just so everyone is aware what we're talking about, basically when you install software on a Linux system, generally what happens is you download that software and it installs via a package manager. So it's kind of like if you're used to Windows, running an exe file on your Windows system. And then basically what happens is all that software has already been configured, basically, and it knows where to go. And the package manager takes all the files, puts them in the right places, and makes sure that you have all of the system libraries and things that you need to run that particular software. But when you compile from source, you really have to have a development environment available on your system. And what you're actually doing is you're taking the source code as it's written from the software developers, and you're actually taking that and turning it into all those various files that you would typically see, the finished products. In other words, what you would typically get with the binary. With the source package, you're actually getting all the raw files. And I know I'm oversimplifying this, but I just want to make sure that people that are listening, maybe who aren't as familiar with Linux systems or haven't done this before, get a good idea of what they're up against in terms of what the differences are between binary and source packages. So is that right? I mean, is that a pretty accurate representation? Did I do it right? And what other differences are there that I might have left out?
Yeah, that is pretty accurate. The biggest difference really is that you don't have to worry about having a development environment or any of that. When you unpack that stage 3 tarball, it installs GCC, it installs, a linker, it installs all these tools to actually build software, and you don't need to worry about it really.
Mm-hmm. Right. So on Gentoo, all that stuff comes with the minimal system that you start with.
Right. You can obviously remove it if you're making an embedded system that you would never want to compile, software on, but that's what comes by default. Right.
Now, let's get back to the different types of distributions, because I think Randal was getting at this before. I mean, obviously, there's distributions like Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, for example. Let's start with that one. So this is obviously geared towards enterprise customers, people that want to run Linux in a data center type environment. And so that distribution is really built around that. Is Gentoo more purposed for the type of person that's doing just a project that they want to get off the ground, or a very narrowly focused system that may only do 1 or 2 tasks? Is that really the difference there? It certainly doesn't seem like Gentoo would be used a lot in an enterprise type environment. Is that correct, or am I wrong?
Well, Gentoo's designed to be very, very wide focus. It works great on servers. It works great on desktops. It works great in like super huge clusters. In an enterprise, it can be a little bit hectic, but usually in an enterprise where you have, 1,000 servers, you'd have a bin host for your company, and then once you compile the package once, it would be easy to deploy to, all 1,000 systems.
Okay. So as long as your systems are identical, you'd be okay with that.
Yeah, pretty much.
The other thing I can see might be an advantage in building your own packages is one of the problems with binary software packages is that you may have compatibility issues on different types of hardware, different types of systems. Certainly between the distributions, you have to have different packages, whether you support a Debian-based system like Ubuntu and lots of other distributions do, or whether you have an RPM-based distribution like Fedora or Red Hat. Certainly there's going to be differences there. But even within a given, depending on what kernel you're running, depending on what hardware you have, there can be problems with given packages, and maybe you have to install more than one to get your software working. I know I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but does Gentoo is one of the advantages here that it actually, since you're compiling from scratch, it can actually detect some of those changes, some of those differences, and you end up with a software package that is more compatible and works better with your given system that you're running, the hardware that you're running.
It definitely does. The biggest thing is because it's compiled, you can have crazy differences in versions. For example, if for some reason you wanted to run GNOME 3 and with the kernel 2.6.9 from 8 years ago, in theory you can on Gentoo. If you want to run KDE 3 on a completely modern system with all the latest kernel, all the latest software, again, in theory, you can do that in Gentoo, which is really not the case with most other distros.
Right. Now, are there distributions that are Gentoo based, like there are in Ubuntu land, where you've got, for example, I run Mythbuntu at home for my Myth TV distribution, and of course that's Ubuntu with just the stuff that you need to run Myth TV. Do people do that with Gentoo as well and release that kind of as a side distribution or a distribution based on Gentoo?
Not really, because in Gentoo, it's just so easy to run, emerge Myth TV, and then 10 or 20 minutes later, you just start it, and effectively you have Mythbuntu. I mean, you'd have to set up your TV tuner and all that stuff, but
right.
Yeah,
but Emerge takes care of that. Now, I'm going to actually walk through this a little bit. Once I get my network set up, I'm going to try to do an Emerge. But when you run Emerge, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that there's a lot of options for the different configuration settings. What is that like? Can you walk us through that process a little bit, or tell us about Emerge in a little bit more detail?
Sure. Well, Emerge is the command to install packages. It's sort of like yum install or apt-get install on Red Hat or Ubuntu or Debian or what have you. And when you go to emerge a package, by default, it just goes through and it doesn't ask you, but you can pass the ask parameter or pretend, and it'll just spit out the list of packages it's going to install. And it says next to the package name, LDAP, KDE, GTK, and so on. And then you either set in a file called /etc/make.conf or in /etc/portage/package.use. You either set, let's say the KDE use flag globally, or you can set it per package. And then you just, run emerge again, and it installs that package with, KDE support enabled.
Okay. So let's just test this. So I've got my system. While we've been talking, I've set up the network, the interface. So I can ping Google. So I know I'm getting out to the internet. So this is just a base system. I haven't done anything else on it except configure the network. So what's a good package to test with? What would it be a good thing to run a merge with to configure? Something that doesn't take forever.
I would say emerge -a Emacs.
Okay. For Randal.
Yep.
Yay.
Emerge. EMERGE, right?
Yeah. You're on the live CD, which is why this is not going to work.
Oh, it's not even going to work.
Yeah.
Wow, so much for the live demo.
Yeah. You have to go through pretty much most of the install steps in the handbook to be able to emerge. But the great thing is, even though it's not great, the install is not great for a newbie, the handbook is very, very good, and it walks you through pretty much everything you have to do.
So that's a good point. So where is the handbook if we went to the website?
If you go to the website, on the left-hand side, there's a link under Get Started called Gentoo Handbook, and that'll take you straight there.
Okay, great. I just found it. So I'm going to try to walk through this a little bit more while Randal asks some questions. We'll see if we can get back to the point where we can have an installed system. We'll see how well that goes.
Cool. Thanks, Aaron. As I'm listening to this, I'm trying to compare it to things that I'm familiar with. And one of the things I'm most familiar with these days, since I do a lot of FreeBSD management, is the FreeBSD port system. I'm wondering if you knew enough about ports to be able to compare that to portage.
Well, actually, portage is based on ports. The guy who created Gentoo actually used FreeBSD for a time, and he saw, oh, this ports thing is pretty cool, and he actually based portage on it. And it's very similar in many ways to ports. It's just a lot easier to use because, it's simpler to just emerge package, and there you go. It's pretty much just as easy to change compile time options, and like I mentioned earlier, you have selectable versions, which I don't believe there's an easy way to do in FreeBSD ports.
Well, I mean, clearly the system is out of the box where you have to go into the right directory and type make isn't particularly friendly, but a couple of very common layers on top of that, port master and port, what's the other one? Port updater, I think. Sort of do all the stuff behind the scenes, including all the recursions and all the way down, and making sure that all the configs are set up ahead of time and things like that. So it's not bad. I would probably say that port master is as close as I can see to what emerge is doing. You basically say port master one thing, and then everything else needs to get installed from it gets installed, so it just works out really nice. So maybe there's some similarities. Now, as I was researching for the show, I saw that there was actually I was surprised to see Gentoo FreeBSD, which is a FreeBSD release using, I believe, Gentoo's portage system and maybe some other, as I heard in the chat channel last night, secret sauce, so that it would work well with the sort of Gentoo way of doing things. Are you familiar with the FreeBSD Gentoo?
I am pretty familiar with it. Basically, Gentoo FreeBSD is the FreeBSD kernel and userland, all the basic stuff like, MV, LS, stuff like that. With the Gentoo's portage package management system and Gentoo's OpenRC init system, which Gentoo's OpenRC is like standard init on, Debian, Ubuntu, Linux distributions.
Okay, so there's so I might not be familiar with that because, again, I'm not familiar with standard Linux distributions. I've had to play with it a couple times for some of my clients. So there's, I actually sort of prefer, but maybe it's because of my familiarity, I prefer the FreeBSD RC setup. Is that available too, or are you really just picking one or the other?
It really isn't available. You kind of have no choice but to use OpenRC on Gentoo FreeBSD because it is kind of first a Gentoo system and kind of second a FreeBSD system.
Okay, and the portage ports is something in the order of 10,000 ports, and I know that FreeBSD's ports is something like 25,000 things. So would I find many things not available to me simply because I'm using portage, or is there some way to mix and match those as well?
Well, not necessarily. I've noticed in FreeBSD ports, for example, there's, let's say, a package called GCC 4.3 for GCC 4.3, or PostgreSQL 9.2 for Postgres 9.2. In Gentoo, that's all handled in the GCC package or the PostgreSQL package, and so there's no need to have splits there, for example.
Oh, so it's probably covering the same total space. It's just divided up a little bit differently, so we count them a different head count.
Exactly.
But does it work similar to it in the sense that, well, you say emerge, Emacs, and can you give some variations there then? I say Emacs, but I don't want the X version. Do you do that in the emerge command, or do you get some configuration screens that pop up, or what?
You don't get any configuration screens. You basically have to echo minus X to either your etc make.conf or package.use file. You can pass it as a parameter on the command line, but that's not recommended.
So this would be similar to editing in ports, editing etc make.conf and throwing a bunch of things in there that apply to all ports, or there's actually ways to make it apply only to certain ports, but it requires a lot more if-then else's in there. Okay. Oh, exactly. That's not so bad then. Okay. So I would actually probably be able to go ahead and play with this. But so now I'm wondering, other than the fact that it's got the Gentoo label and the cool penguin logo to go with it, why would I choose Gentoo FreeBSD over stock FreeBSD?
Well, personally, I'm not a huge fan of FreeBSD. I think ports is a bit antiquated, and BSD init isn't bad, but it's not great. If you were to look at a ebuild, which is what Gentoo uses as build scripts, they're very simple. They're very easy to write. Some of them are even less than 15 lines, and it's very straightforward. For example, in FreeBSD ports, I haven't been able to figure out a way to have it show me all the dependencies it's going to install before it actually installs them one at a time.
Yeah, that is a bit tricky. One way to do that is with port master, you can have it go all through all the recursion, all the configuration, and then it says, oh, I'm about to install all these things. You can Control-C out of that. That's the way I figured out what happens if I want to say, install this thing. What else do I have to install that I don't have already? And let it go through all the dependencies. I think part of the problem with that, not to fault the FreeBSD project, but a given makefile can have different dependencies depending on the configuration of that makefile, or the configuration inputs to that makefile. So, for example, for the Emacs one might have, if you have without X11 in your main make.conf, then of course it's not going to drill down through all the X11 packages that it might have to install for the first time. So how would you, looking at only just the Emacs package without going through all the configuration logic, know the dependencies until you do that? So Portmaster does let you do that, and it gives you a chance right at the last second then to hit Control-C and say, no, I don't really want to install all these things. I'm just having you go through the effort just so you'd show me what would be installed for that. So there is a way, but I think it's because, again, the FreeBSD is based on makefiles, and so makefiles can do a lot of work, including dynamically compute dependencies. Does that help you understand that?
It does, and Gentoo can actually do the same. Like, for example, if a package has the SSL use flag option, it can have the dependency, open SSL, and if you have the SSL use flag enabled, it'll pull an open SSL.
Okay. Yeah, so I think they're probably doing similar. I mean, it's probably like some way in both. So we're talking fairly closely related things here. Now, so given one of the things I wanted to ask about was machine architecture, because I know that somewhere I've read, I might be wrong about this by now, but like the different kinds of x86 chips, the different kinds of AMD chips, or even AMD 64 versus x86 64, that there's a way to compile it so that it works sort of everywhere. And that's what the general distributions do, to be able to distribute it widely and have it boot up on systems. But then there are things you can do given the specific chip architecture that are better. Is Gentoo able to address that because it's going to be compiling everything from source, at least at some point?
Yes. In your etc.make.conf, like you were mentioning in FreeBSD, you can set your C flags, which will tell the compiler kind of what optimizations you can use. And you can either, and this is the default, optimize for, pretty much all Intel or AMD CPUs, or you can optimize for kind of exactly your specific CPU, which might make the software perform a little better, but you can't make it a binary for, a really old system, for example.
Yeah, but that makes sense though. If I have the box sitting in front of me that this thing's only ever going to run on, and it emulates a 8-core, whatever the i7 is, which is what my laptop is here. I can tell it, hey, I got an i7, make it work precisely for that and nothing else, and it would be just fine then. Yeah.
Yeah, and it would perform, a bit better.
Okay, cool. Getting more sort of general questions. Well, actually, I have a licensing question. So the FreeBSD is BSD licensed, and is any part of the Gentoo project not BSD licensed or compatibly licensed?
Actually, the entire Gentoo project is GPL2.
Okay. And how does that work when you mix it with the FreeBSD release then?
I'm actually not too familiar with the whole licensing situation there. Again, we're not FreeBSD. We just basically take, a couple of the tarballs and use them to build a working system off of, a couple of e-builds.
Okay. Okay, well, that makes sense. Actually, I got Ryo from the chat room is saying OpenRC, which I guess is one of the key components of FreeBSD. The Gentoo FreeBSD is BSD licensed. So I guess that's what allows them to kind of bring that across without really having some distribution issues. So that's cool. So let's talk a little bit more about you. How did you get involved with open source, and what attracted you to it, and is it part of your day job now to be doing this?
It isn't part of my day job. Mainly at work, I work on Windows machines, although we do have a couple of Debian boxes. I got interested in open source probably more than a decade ago when I was just playing around with random stuff, and I came across this thing called Linux and thought, hey, this looks cool. I'll try it out. And, that was kind of back in the old days when nothing really worked well, but it was fun. It was interesting. And, I got back into it a couple of years later, and I've been using it ever since.
Okay, great. And so, what? You say you're a developer for Gentoo. How does that interaction actually work? Do you hang out on mailing lists and chat rooms for it, or are you just simply submitting patches for particular things that you find interesting, or what?
It pretty much involves just hanging out on IRC and the mailing lists, and occasionally, fixing bugs and stabilizing packages and adding new stuff to the tree, and generally it's pretty fun.
And who decides ultimately the roadmap and is the ultimate arbiter of what goes into Gentoo? Is it all committee based, or is there some sort of fearless leader or some sort of combination of the two?
Well, there is a committee that determines kind of very generic decisions, or decisions kind of where there's some disagreement between developers. But for the most part, for what goes in the tree and what's kind of going to be the future, it's just down to, as a developer, what do you want to put in the tree, and what do you want to do in the future? Okay.
When you commit things to Gentoo, is there a copyright assignment required, or is it just the license that allows you to redistribute that?
It's just the license that allows you to, GPL2.
Okay. From the chat room, I don't know what these are, so I'm just going to ask about them. What is Funtoo and Sabian?
Okay, with Funtoo, the original guy who created Gentoo is a guy named Daniel Robbins, and he decided he kind of wasn't entirely happy with the direction Gentoo was going, because in some cases, Gentoo can take a long time to move forward because we try and be extremely stable.
Mm-hmm.
And Daniel Robbins basically created Funtoo as a derivative distribution that is a little bit more forward-thinking and tries to push the envelope a little bit more. And, many of those changes that they make have improvements in Gentoo as well.
Okay.
For example, OpenRC is a relatively new init system, and Funtoo switched to it about 2 years ago, and Gentoo only switched about 6 months ago. But in those, in that 1.5 year gap, Funtoo found a lot of bugs and, a lot of possible upgrading issues that were fixed before Gentoo switched.
Okay, so you might consider Funtoo's relationship to Gentoo to be somewhat like Fedora versus Red Hat?
In a way, yes.
Okay, and then what's the other one? Savion? It's already scrolled away.
Savion is it's basically a desktop distribution that is a Gentoo derivative that acts a bit like Ubuntu or Fedora or what have you. You load up the live DVD with XFCE or GNOME or KDE or LXDE or whatever, and then there's an installer, and you just go through the installer and you're ready to go.
Okay. I'm also familiar with something that's really difficult for a lot of port systems to get right, which is like the CPAN for Perl and the equivalent for Python and Ruby, that gems for Ruby, where they have dependencies built inside them. I mean, the description file for a CPAN entry for Perl says, for me to be installed, I've also got to install these things. Does the Portage system, is that able to take advantage of that information to also add that into Portage's idea of what has to be deinstalled if something else is installed?
Well, obviously, Portage has dependencies, but for stuff like Ruby and Perl, there's a tool called, for Perl, gcpan, that will take the CPAN info file or whatever it is, and through that generate an e-build for you, and then also generate e-builds for all the required dependencies that currently are not in Portage.
So that sounds pretty good. Does the same thing happen for gems?
I believe it does. I believe... I actually can't recall. I believe there's a tool like gcpan for Ruby gems, but I'm not too familiar with it.
Okay. And so that means that I could, rather naively, because I know it's a big problem with a lot of the other distributions. I mean, when I was working with OpenBSD, one of the reasons I left it is because in order for you to install a CPAN module, about 50% of the CPAN modules I wanted to install already had a port worked out for them. But anything that went beyond that, you just had to install it blindly. And it was like, and then it could stomp on files that there are other CPAN ports already created. It was just a mess. At least FreeBSD got that right, because whenever you install something that doesn't have a port for it, it magically creates pseudo packages all the way down so that it has all the dependency stuff all tracked into it. It's probably very similar to what Portage is doing there with GCPan. But I'm very happy that packager systems have figured this out because of the dependencies around that. So, how much of your time do you spend on the Gentoo project then in a given week or month?
I probably spend about maybe 10 hours a week or so working on Gentoo. Probably more than that, but it's really the biggest open source project I'm involved with, and I'm really passionate about it because I think Gentoo is a really, really great distribution that's really underrated, and I'd like to see that kind of change.
Okay. What other projects are you involved with? What else do you do? I noticed on the information you submitted, you talked a little bit about a theme.
Yeah, I'm a developer on the atheme.org project, and we do mostly IRC stuff. We develop, a IRCD, IRC server, and IRC services like ChanServe, NixServe, etc. that are pretty popular. And other than that, I do random things. I submit random patches when I find, bugs and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I see you also do a podcast. Is that correct?
I do. It's kind of stupid. I do a distro review podcast called DistroCast, and it's basically me and my co-host drinking beer and reviewing Linux distros.
Uh-huh. And you're not biased at all, of course, when you do that, right?
Of course not.
Well, what's your pitch? I mean, when you talk to people and they're like, "Oh, I'm an Ubuntu user," or "I'm a Fedora user," and you want to sell them on switching to Gentoo, you say, "Well, you should really try Gentoo because what?"
Well, my pitch is generally you should really try Gentoo because Gentoo can be whatever you need and whatever you want. For example, I left Arch Linux because they switched to GNOME 3 and at the time had no real way to get back to a GNOME 2-like environment. Mm-hmm. They do now, but they didn't back then. And I switched to Gentoo because right now you can get GNOME 2 on Gentoo, you can get GNOME 3, you can get KD3 or KD4. And also, for example, a lot of packages have, let's say, additional KDE or GNOME integration. And to not have extra dependencies, that might be disabled in Fedora or Ubuntu or Debian. But in Gentoo, you can say, no, I want the additional GNOME support, or I want the additional KDE support, and it'll compile that in.
Right. Well, I can certainly identify that just going through the process of trying out, the newer Ubuntu distributions that the ones that have come out lately. With kind of, and if you follow me online or have me in your Google Plus circles, that I kind of am frustrated a little bit with Ubuntu and the inflexibility that they offer. Or that they have regarding some of those things that you just mentioned. So I can identify with that a little bit in terms of just wanting the flexibility to set up your system the way you want it to be and not be forced down a particular path. I was surprised you didn't say in your answer, I was surprised you didn't say just because it's the more manly version. You have to compile all your packages. Come on, be a man. Do you ever try that out, or does that just not work?
That usually doesn't work with most people, it's kind of the whole thing. But it takes too much time, which it really doesn't. But, compiling with portages is surprisingly easy, and it's actually pretty fast on a decent system. I mean, I remember, installing Gentoo on an old Pentium 4 and Firefox literally taking 3 hours to compile.
That can be quite a delay if you really just want to get the thing running and being on the net. So I can appreciate the sort of slight bit of hissing and casting against Gentoo because of all this build idea. I want to take this just a slight different direction. So again, one of the reasons you're saying we should be using Gentoo is because we can trigger all the dials, change everything we want to change around and make the system going. So one of these things that I know Linux people like to brag about is how small they can make a distribution that actually boots on a system, like how small of a stick they can get it on and all that stuff. Does Gentoo have knobs that you can crank all the way to the tiny end to do stuff like this?
It does. There is a unofficial project called Tiny Gentoo that has Gentoo, I believe, running in something like 32 megabytes of flash and like something like 6 megabytes of RAM, I believe.
Wow, that's pretty small.
Yeah. And it's running with, UC libc and BusyBox and all that stuff and all statically linked, but it can get pretty small.
Well, that would be great for like a rescue disk then, right? And actually, I've been told in the chat room once again that there's something called a derivative called a System Rescue CD.
Yeah, well, I kind of wanted to explain this a little further.
Sure.
When we were discussing about derivatives, there really isn't anything like the derivatives of Ubuntu with like Kubuntu that just changes, KDE and that's it, or Linux Mint that adds a couple of things and that's it. But there are derivatives that are kind of have a completely different purpose. Like System Rescue CD, for example, is a really cool live environment that, has a lot of tools like gparted and test disk and ClamAV, I believe, and all sorts of stuff to, fix up your system when everything goes wrong.
Okay, yeah, so it's not meant to be a full, you're not going to then add Firefox to that or something. That'd be silly.
Right.
Okay, very good. Well, we're just about out of time, according to the big clock on the corner over here. So is there anything I haven't asked you that you want to make sure that our audience knows about?
Well, one thing is, with all this, don't think that Gentoo is a bleeding edge distro that's crazy unstable. In my experience, Gentoo stable is just as stable as, Debian stable or RHEL or, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And just, Gentoo is really the one distribution I've tried that's actually fun to play around with. So just kind of have fun.
Sounds great. Just bring up on that though is how often are things merged from upstream? I mean, is there much of a delay? It sounds like you don't actually even have releases then, right? You just say emerge today, and then you can emerge again tomorrow, and then emerge the next day, or are there specific sort of release cycles?
Gentoo is a rolling release distro, which means there aren't release cycles. You can upgrade, like you said, today, tomorrow, Friday, and have fun. And stuff's merged from upstream pretty much as soon as upstream makes a release. It might take 2 days, but it's usually pretty quick. Except for, the critical system stuff that might break everything.
And I presume that there are people on the Gentoo team that are watching all the appropriate cert lists for the upstream software problems and are getting those quickly into there to try to prevent too much damage after 0 days, right?
Yeah, we try to be extremely quick on security issues, and we tend to have, even into Gentoo's stable distribution, or what we call Arch, we tend to have less than a couple of days between upstream making a fix and us pushing that fix to stable.
Great. It sounds like it could be something reliable even for a business environment then as well, in terms of not being too attackable when things go bad. Jeff, we're running out of time, so I just wanted to say thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Thanks, Jeff. That was Jeff Horelick, who is representing the Gentoo project as one of the core developers, and talked to us about how Gentoo is all put together. What'd you think, Aaron?
Well, it's about time we had Gentoo on. We talked a little bit about this. This isn't your grandma's Linux distribution, or even your mother's, or probably most of your relatives. But it is pretty difficult to set up. I mean, that's one of the things that I think people don't realize right away. And if you don't have a little bit of technical savvy or a great deal of curiosity, you're going to get turned off pretty quickly. That being said, if you go look at the documentations, the handbook that they have is excellent. If you go look at the handbook, it's actually a great learning tool for Linux because it takes you through all the various install steps that I used to do back when I was running Red Hat 5 or whatever it was, where you actually had to partition your own disks. And you actually have to format those partitions and set things up and download your stages and actually install that. That's what I'm doing right now in the demos. I'm actually uncompressing the tarball that has all the various stages, and it just finished. So all these things that you used to have to do that now you don't with the GUIs and things, a lot of those things which are important to know have become obscured. So now you have to go take a class to learn these things because you're not forced to do them when you're installing a system. So this can be a really good exercise. I mean, if I was teaching a class, maybe a middle school level class or something like that, or maybe high school, and I wanted to walk people through how to set up a Linux environment, this is the way I would do it. I would say, let's go set up Gentoo. In the end, you get to the same result. In the end, you get to the point where you've got your graphical interface and all those kinds of things. But I think going through the steps are very valuable for somebody that just wants to learn about Linux and how to get started in it.
Yeah, it does sound like a lot like that. And I like the way you put that because it's like this is the tinkerer's distribution. This is back when we wouldn't buy like the entire. Oh boy, I'm going to date myself here. But the entire oscilloscope, we would buy the kit to make the oscilloscope,
right?
So that in the process of going through and looking at all the pieces that go into it, you would see the horizontal vertical deflector power. You would see the inputs and the attenuators for that. You'd see it was sort of cool that way. And we're at the point now where a lot of programmers even aren't taking classes in compiler technology. Heaven forbid that they would not know that, but that's a handy thing to remember how to do or learn how to do. I guess it's the same argument for there's people that don't know how to do long multiply anymore either because it's all being done by calculators for us. But yeah, no, so this looks like fun, and I think what I like about it is that in order to get this to work, they had to document all those steps,
right?
And they had to say, the documentation that I was able to skim in the last couple of days showed me a lot of that. That really. There are knobs all over the place, but they tell you what the knobs do, and it's like, oh, yeah, okay, so, cranking the voltage up to 65 here is going to blow something out, so don't do that. That's nice.
Right. Yep.
Anyway, great. Anything else before we move on?
Well, it's kind of interesting, the similarities. You guys talked about CPAN for a little bit, and I thought, the similarities, there are some similarities there in terms of, with the whole emerge process and finding the package that you want and actually compiling it and adding in the options and things. Getting most of my stuff from CPAN back when I was working with Perl quite a bit more than I do today, there was an advantage there. And, you can't make binaries for everything. So, if you've got a specialized piece of hardware that you need to run, you want to run Linux on, maybe Gentoo is one way to be able to do that and get things to work for your system that there may not be binary packages available for.
Or, as we were also discussing in the chat room earlier as well, that you might want to have just a certain distro that you're using only for the routers that don't need all the extra stuff like a C compiler and things like that. And so you can build that with Gentoo and just install that on your machines, maybe on diskless machines, so that you don't have to have lots of extra flying media and things like that. So yeah. Anyway, cool. So awkward transition of the week is simply I'm going to start talking about our upcoming guests. That's not very awkward. That's actually just literal. Okay, so I said last week that I was going to try to book some more people coming up, and I tell you, it's funny. As I started looking at this, I started seeing all these requests in my upcoming list for new projects, and I said, oh, I should move those out of my inbox into, say, FLOSS Weekly To-Do folder. And as I started doing, I said, well, good name for that would be like FW-To-Do. Okay, well, when I tried to move it there, it said that folder already exists and has about 200 messages in it. So I had this brilliant idea about a year ago, and I put a lot of people's requests in there. already, and they've been sitting there for a year. So I have a lot of people I need to contact now. I've been screaming for the last 6 months, just send me some more, but you guys already have sent me a huge pile. So I'm going to sort that all out this weekend and hopefully start booking Q3 this weekend before I get on the cruise ship. But coming up, we do already have booked. Next week, we've got Aaron, you coming into the studio again to do interview somebody for the Apache Software Foundation, which should be a lot of fun. We've talked about them a number of times in this show. Now, finally get it from the horse's mouth, as it were. Following week, and I won't be on that show. I'll be on a cruise ship next week, so you won't see me in here. LiveVirt, virtual virtualization, basically having software be able to talk to all the different kinds of virtualization things like VirtualBox. What is it? VirtualBox. There we go. Trying to figure out what other thing came from Oracle that's like that. VirtualBox and KVM and Zen and stuff, sort of isolate you so you can write the same software that works everywhere across there. We also have LibreOffice coming up in 2 weeks. Is that 2 weeks? 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Which is the fork of OpenOffice. So that should be a lot of fun to talk to. Excito, the Home Media Center. I like the name, Excito. It just sounds great. Their Home Media Center, Home Media Server, and so it's a piece of hardware that they're trying to sell you, but you can also just run the software on any commodity hardware, and so we're going to talk to them about that. Again, opening up Q3 bookings shortly. If you go to twit.tv/floss, you can see our current spreadsheet linked to all these things. You're going to see that extend by another 50 names sometime over this weekend because I've got 50 more projects that are in my queue that I haven't even gotten to yet. You can also follow us on Floss Weekly on Google+. I announce, as soon as I book a guest, I announce the guest that's coming up this week, and I usually announce about an hour ahead of time that we have a show going on. You can also follow us on Floss Weekly at either Twitter or Identica. I try to post there as well. As you heard a few times in this show, we do have a live chat going on while we're taping the show. We tape shows at 9:30, typically at 9:30 a.m. on Wednesdays. And you can go to live.twit.tv, and there's both the video feeds. You can watch what we're doing behind the scenes, watch all the mistakes we make. And also you can chat with us. There's a chat room link right there as well. Me personally, you can follow me at Merlin, Merlyn, on Twitter and Identica, but more likely you're going to see my 5 or 6 posts to Google Plus every day, and I'm Randal L. Schwartz there, so you can check on me on that. If you follow those, you'll also know that I'm going to be in New York City tomorrow. We have a meetup tomorrow night at DBA on 41 First Avenue. It's a great little place it's a good scotch bar. Got a lot of great scotches and other hard alcohol. Good thing I'm actually staying about 5 blocks away from there, so it should be hard for me to get home. I'm also going to be in Madison, Wisconsin from June 12th to 16th for YAPC North America. I'll be in Portland for OSCON. Just got accepted there as a Floss Weekly host. So I'm actually got press credentials, which is really cool because press credentials actually get you in anywhere. It's even better than being a speaker. So I'm glad I applied for that and got that this year. So you'll see me there at OSCON. I think Simon Phipps and I are going to be doing the typical live show on Wednesday from there as well. I also got accepted to go to Porto Alegre to talk at FISLE on July 25th and 28th.
Great show.
Yeah, that's always a fun little gig. I haven't gotten to go for the last couple of years because it's actually been the same week as OSCON. OSCON moved up a week this year, so not the same week as FISLE again. So, and the following week after that, so it would be like July 30th or so, I'm actually going to be in Rio, hanging out with the Rio Pearlmongers. So I'll be down there if you're in that area. I'll watch for my tweets as well. That's enough plugging. Aaron, what are you planning to plug today?
Definitely go to thesourceshow.org. You can check all my old video podcasts that I used to do. I've still got a couple I'm working on. But I've been saying that for a year now. So, go to that website, but most importantly, go to Google Plus and follow me there. It's the best way to get in touch with me or follow me or recommend things that I might be interested in viewing. So go to Google Plus, add me to your circles, and you'll see all the kinds of crazy things that I follow about making stuff and Android and open source and funny Star Trek and Star Wars things. So definitely go to Google Plus and add me to your circles, and that's the best way to get in touch with me.
Very cool, very cool, Aaron. Well, thank you again for driving all the way up to Petaluma to host the show with all of Leo Laporte's toys up there. That's always handy when you can do that for me. And I also especially want to thank you ahead of time, although I'll thank you again afterwards, for hosting the show next week because, again, I'm off of the ship, and this keeps us so we can keep moving the show forward week by week. Yeah.
Now, next week, I just got to ask, is the Open Source Initiative's upcoming president going to be involved in that one?
No.
Okay. Well, just curious.
No, I think we've got Dan Lynch as the co-host for you.
I just wanted to mention that Simon Phipps was.
And that's news.
Right. Simon. I mean, we don't do news usually on this one, but I just wanted to mention, and kind of in closing, that Simon Phipps was appointed as the president of the OSI. whenever that happened, yesterday, a couple days ago. So.
Yeah. So, congratulations to Simon for he's been involved with the OSI for quite a while, but actually have gotten his cohorts to have said, "Yeah, you're the head dude. You're the one taking the arrows through the head." That's kind of nice. So, yeah, thanks, congratulations, Simon, for that. So, yay! Well, I hear the music coming up. You know what that means? About time to say we'll see you all again next week on FLOSS Weekly.